My birthday, my parents hosted a dinner with 100 relatives just to disown me. My dad handed me a bill and said every cent we wasted raising you. Pay or never contact us again. My sister grabbed my car keys from the table and said Dad already transferred the title to me. I walked out without a word. 4 days later, they are calling me 50 times a day. To understand why they are calling, you have to understand the silence that started it all. The silence began exactly at 7:30 in the evening. From the outside, my parents' house looked like a photo spread in a lifestyle magazine. The driveway was lined with imported birch, trees that looked beautiful but died every winter, because they were not built for this climate. That was the theme of our family. We valued aesthetics over survival. I stood in the entryway, adjusting the strap of my bag. My shoes were sensible, flat, and comfortable. They were the shoes of someone who walked to work, someone who stood in server rooms for 8 hours a day, fixing other people's mistakes. They were not the shoes of a daughter who belonged in this house. Inside, the air conditioning was set to chilling 65 degrees. My mother, Elaine, believed that cold air preserved things. It kept the flowers fresh, the makeup from running, and the conversations polite. Nearly 100 people were packed into the dining hall and the spillover rooms. These were not just family. They were witnesses. My uncles, aunts, distant cousins, and business partners of my father were all seated at round tables covered in white linen. The hum of conversation sounded like a hive of bees, low and vibrating. I walked in, and the temperature seemed to drop another 5 degrees. My mother was the first to see me. She was adjusting a flower arrangement, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. She did not hug me. She did not say happy birthday. She glanced at my jacket, frowned at a microscopic lint speck, and then pointed toward table 4. It was a table near the kitchen door, usually reserved for vendors or distant relatives. You only invited out of obligation. I took my seat. I was Camila, the invisible daughter. I was the one who fixed the Wi-Fi during parties so my father could show off his stock portfolio. I was the one who balanced the household budget software when my mother lost the passwords. I was useful. And in the unspoken constitution of our household, utility was the only currency that mattered. My sister, Lena, was different. I looked across the room to the head table. Lena was glowing. She was wearing a dress that likely cost more than my first car, laughing at a joke my father had just told. She did not have to be useful. She just had to be adored. Dinner began with the usual precision. Waiters moved in synchronization. Wine was poured. Glasses clinked. I kept my head down, eating quickly, checking the time on my phone under the table. I told myself I just had to make it to the cake. Once the cake was cut, I could claim a headache and leave. I could go back to my quiet apartment, my code, and my life. But the cake never came. Instead, my father, Richard, stood up. He tapped a spoon against his wine glass. The sound was sharp, piercing through the ambient noise. The room fell silent. It was not a warm silence. It was the silence of a courtroom before a verdict. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He looked at me. For the first time all night, everyone looked at me. He did not ask me to come to the front. He walked to me. He carried a black leather folder, the kind he used for contract negotiations. He stopped at my table, towering over me. The guests watched, confused, expecting a speech or a grand gift. Richard slid the folder across the tablecloth. It made a heavy, dry sound, like sandpaper on skin. "Open it," he said. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a man who believed he was being generous. My hands were shaking, just slightly, as I lifted the cover. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a spreadsheet, itemized and totaled. I read the categories: housing, food, clothing, medical expenses, tuition. Beside each category was a number. And at the bottom, bolded and double, underlined, was the sum. $248,312. I looked up at him. I did not understand. He cleared his throat, ensuring the entire room could hear him. He said, "Camila, we have been running the numbers. This is the cost of raising you. We view it as a failed investment. You are 30 years old. You are mediocre. You are a drain on this family's resources and reputation." The room gasped. A few nervous laughs bubbled up and died quickly. He continued, "This is not a punishment. This is accountability. You are an adult. Adults settle their debts. You will pay this back with interest or we are done. No contact. No family. You are written off." My ears began to ring. A high-pitched whine that drowned out the murmur of the crowd. I looked at my mother. She was studying her napkin, refusing to meet my eyes. She had already made her choice. Silence was her peace. Before I could speak, before I could even process the absurdity of being invoiced for my own childhood, my sister moved. Lena did not rush. She glided. She walked to the table, her eyes bright with malice. She reached out and placed her hand over my car keys, which sat next to my water glass. I watched her fingers close around the metal. "Dad signed the title over to me this morning," Lena said. Her voice was light, conversational. "You were not using it to its full potential, anyway. It is an Audi, Camila. You treat it like a bus." She pulled the keys toward her. The metal scraped against the table. I stared at her hand. That car was not a gift. I had made the payments for 3 years. I had paid for the oil changes, the tires, the insurance. But the title, the piece of paper that mattered, had remained in my father's name for insurance purposes. A technicality. A trap. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. My father raised a hand, stopping me. "One last thing," he said. He gestured to the back of the room. Standing near the service entrance, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the wallpaper, was Mark, my boss. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mark stepped forward, wringing his hands. He looked at the floor, then at my father, and finally, briefly, at me. "I am sorry, Camila," Mark said. "Based on some new information regarding your background and character provided by your family, we have to terminate your contract. Effective immediately. Security will box up your things." It was a total demolition. In the span of 3 minutes, they had stripped me of my past, my transportation, and my future. They had done it in front of an audience. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry, to beg, to make a scene that would justify their cruelty. They wanted to point at the hysterical woman and say, "See, this is why we had to cut her off." I looked at Richard, smug and powerful. I looked at Lena, dangling my keys on her finger like a trophy. I looked at the invoice on the table. $248,000. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. It was not fear. It was clarity. I did not scream. I did not argue. I did not even frown. I picked up the folder. I folded it neatly and placed it in my bag. I pushed my chair in. The legs of the chair scraped against the floor, the only sound in the dead silent room. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the door. "Camila," my father barked. "Walk out that door, and you are dead to us." I kept walking. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the night. The humidity hit me, thick and real. The gravel crunched under my sensible shoes. I walked down the long driveway, past the dying birch trees, past the luxury cars of the witnesses. I walked until the house was just a glowing speck behind me. I had no car. I had no job. I had a bill for $250,000 in my purse. But as I reached the main road and turned toward the city, I realized something else. For the first time in my life, I was free. And I had work to do. The gravel of the long driveway eventually gave way to the smooth, cooling asphalt of the main road. I did not look back. I knew what I would see if I did. The house would be glowing like a cruise ship in the darkness, the windows bright with the party that was continuing without me. My father would be telling a story, likely casting himself as the victim of a difficult daughter. My mother would be nodding, sipping her wine, relieved that the problem had removed itself from the premises. I focused on the rhythm of my shoes hitting the pavement. Left, right. The sensible shoes that my sister had mocked were now the only reason I could make this journey. It was 3 miles to my apartment complex. A 45-minute walk if I kept a steady pace. The suburbs were quiet. It was a Tuesday night. I walked past houses that looked nothing like my parents' estate. These were normal homes with basketball hoops in the driveways and blue flickering lights from televisions washing over living room walls. I smelled cut grass and dryer sheets. I heard the hiss of a sprinkler system ticking like a metronome. It was a brutal, beautiful normalcy. Inside those houses, people were arguing about whose turn it was to do the dishes or laughing at a sitcom. They were not handing their children invoices. They were not stealing car keys as a party trick. As the adrenaline began to fade, the physical reality of my situation settled in, heavy and cold. I started doing the math. I could not help it. It was how my brain was wired. I had $1,200 in my checking account. My rent was $1,800, due in 6 days. I had a credit card with a $5,000 limit, but I rarely used it. My savings were modest. Maybe 3 months of expenses if I ate rice and beans. But the biggest variable was the car. The Audi was not just a vehicle, it was my commute. My office was 20 miles away in an industrial park with no reliable bus service. Then I remembered. I did not have an office anymore. Mark had fired me before the appetizer course. I let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. They had been thorough. My father believed in comprehensive strategies. He had not just cut the branch I was sitting on, he had burned the tree down. My feet began to ache around mile 2. The strap of my bag dug into my shoulder, the leather folder inside feeling like a lead weight. That folder, the bill. It was ridiculous, legally unenforceable. A piece of theater. But it was not the money that stung. It was the itemization. I walked past a street lamp, the orange light buzzing overhead. And a memory hit me so hard I almost stopped walking. I was 16 years old. It was the night of my parents' annual summer gala. The house was full of local politicians and investors. Suddenly, the music stopped. The lights flickered. The smart home system had crashed. The panic was immediate. My father was red-faced, sweating, terrified of the embarrassment. I did not wait to be asked. I ran to the server closet in the basement. I rebooted the main stack, bypassed the faulty switch, and rerouted the audio through the backup channel. It took me 4 minutes. The music came back on. The lights stabilized. When I came upstairs, covered in dust, my father did not hug me. He did not introduce me to the mayor. He patted me on the shoulder, 2 firm taps, and whispered, "Good job. You saved us the service call fee." Then he handed me a $20 bill and told me to go clean up before anyone saw me. I had held on to that $20 for weeks. I thought it was a reward. Now, walking alone in the dark, I realized what it was. It was a payment. I had never been a daughter to him. I was an employee who worked for room and board, and tonight he had decided to outsource my position. The realization should have made me cry. I waited for the tears. I waited for the sobbing that usually comes in movies when the protagonist hits rock bottom. But my eyes remained dry. The sadness was there. But it was buried under layers of shock and a growing, hardening layer of cold fury. I reached my apartment complex just after 9 o'clock. It was a nondescript beige building, the kind where neighbors nodded politely, but never learned each other's names. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, my legs burning. I fumbled for my house keys, grateful that at least those had not been on the same ring as the car key my sister had stolen. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air in my apartment was stale and warm. I did not turn on the lights. I did not want to see the emptiness. I locked the deadbolt behind me, and leaned against the door for a long moment, listening to the silence. This silence was different from the one at the dinner party. That silence had been weaponized, heavy with judgment. This silence was mine. It was empty, yes, but it was safe. I walked to the kitchen and drank a glass of tap water. Standing over the sink, I looked at the dark living room. My furniture was second-hand. My rug was from a discount store. Nothing here was impressive. Nothing here would make it into a magazine. But I had paid for every single item. There were no lions on my sofa. There were no investors in my bookshelf. I walked to my desk in the corner of the bedroom. This was my cockpit. My setup was the only expensive thing I owned. A high-performance tower, dual monitors, a mechanical keyboard that clicked with a satisfying precision. I sat down in my ergonomic chair. My feet throbbed, but my hands were steady. I reached into my bag and pulled out the leather folder. I tossed it onto the desk. I did not need to open again. I knew the number. 248,000. I pressed the power button on my computer. The fans whirred to life, a soft, comforting hum. The screens flickered on, bathing the dark room in a cool blue light. The cursor blinked, waiting for a command. My father thought he had taken everything. He thought he had left me powerless because he had taken my money, my job, and my car. But he had forgotten who I was. He had forgotten who fixed his servers. He had forgotten who set up his encrypted cloud backups. He had forgotten that for 10 years, I had been the silent administrator of his entire digital life. I was not Camila the daughter anymore. I was not Camila the victim. I cracked my knuckles. I placed my hands on the keyboard. The silence of the room was broken by the rapid, rhythmic clatter of typing. I was logging in. The blue light of the monitors washed over my face, turning my small bedroom into a command center. I did not feel tired. I did not feel the throbbing in my feet anymore. My brain had shifted gears into a state I called the flow. It was a place where emotions did not exist, only data points, variables, and outcomes. I did not have to break into anything. That was the irony. My father prided himself on security, on locked gates and alarm systems. But his digital hygiene was atrocious. For 10 years, I had been the one to set up his emails, his cloud storage, and his banking apps. I had written the passwords on a sticky note he kept in his top drawer. I knew them by heart because I was the one who had to reset them every time he forgot to turn off caps lock. I typed in the first password. It was my mother's maiden name followed by the year she won a local beauty pageant. Access granted. I started with the main operating account. I expected to see wealth. I expected to see the financial fortress my father bragged about at dinner parties. What I saw instead was a hemorrhage. The screen filled with lines of red. Overdraft fees. Late payment penalties. Transfers from savings to checking that happened with frantic frequency. The account balance was hovering in the low 3 figures. I leaned back in my chair, blinking. This did not make sense. The dinner tonight alone must have cost $20,000. The catering, the wine, the staff. If his main account was empty, how was he paying for the theater of our lives? I opened a second window. I needed to see the credit cards. There it was. He was rotating debt. He was using one card to pay off the minimum balance of another. A shell game of finance that worked only as long as you kept moving the cups fast enough. But eventually, the music stops. And judging by the desperate timestamps on these transfers, the music was slowing down. This explained the invoice. They did not bill me $248,000 because of some twisted moral lesson about accountability. They billed me because they were drowning. They needed a cash injection, and they had decided to harvest their least favorite child to get it. But that was not the whole picture. I knew my father. He was a narcissist, but he was also a coward. He would not risk this level of financial ruin unless he had a backup plan. A safety net he was convinced would catch him. I dug deeper. I went into the archives. I pulled up the transaction history for the last 5 years and ran a simple sort function. I was looking for external inflows. Money coming in that was not a salary and not a refund. A pattern emerged within seconds. On the first of every month, a deposit hit the account. $4,000. Then $5,000. Then recently it had jumped to $7,000 a month. The source was labeled simply as the trust. I frowned. We did not have a trust. My grandparents had died with debt, not assets. I clicked on the transaction details. The source bank was a small regional credit union 3 towns over. The depositor name was Paul and Helen Miller. Uncle Paul. My stomach turned over. Uncle Paul and Aunt Helen were the kindest people in our family. They were retired school teachers who lived in a modest ranch house and drove a 10-year-old sedan. They were not rich, but they were careful. They had saved every penny for 30 years. I opened my email archives and searched for their names. I found a thread from 2 years ago, forwarded to me by my father so I could print an attachment. It was a brochure for a private investment fund, managed by Richard Sterling. My father. The brochure was glossy, filled with buzzwords about high-yield returns and family legacy. He had sold them a lie. He had convinced them to give him their retirement savings, promising to manage it, to grow it. I switched tabs back to the bank statements. I traced the $7,000 that came in from Paul and Helen last month. It stayed in the account for exactly 4 hours. Then, it was transferred out. But it did not go to an investment brokerage. It did not go to stocks or bonds. It went to an account labeled L Corp Expenses. I had set up L Corp 3 years ago. It was the LLC for my sister's influencer career. My father had told me it was for tax purposes, to write off her travel and wardrobe as business expenses. I pulled up the L Corp statements. There it was. The autopsy of a crime. Date October 4th. Amount $3,000. Vendor Delta Airlines. First class to Milan. Date October 5th. Amount $1,200. Vendor the Ritz-Carlton. Date October 7th. Amount $4,500. Vendor Balenciaga. I stared at the screen. The numbers blurred. Uncle Paul was not investing in the market. He was funding Lena's Instagram feed. He and Aunt Helen were eating generic brand cereal and turning down the thermostat to save money, believing their nest egg was growing under my father's brilliant guidance. Meanwhile, my father was funneling their life savings directly into my sister's closet. I felt a cold rage spreading through my veins. Colder than the air conditioning in my parents' house. This was not just mismanagement. This was embezzlement. This was fraud, and then I saw the entry for tonight. Date, November 12th. Amount $18,000. Vendor Elite Catering and Events. Uncle Paul and Aunt Helen had paid for the dinner where I was disowned. They had unwittingly funded the very event designed to humiliate me. I sat in the silence of my apartment. The only sound the hum of the computer fans. My father had built a house of cards on the backs of the people who trusted him. He had stolen from his brother to spoil his golden child. And when the money started to run out, when the Ponzi scheme began to wobble, he had turned his eyes to me. He did not want accountability. He wanted a scapegoat. If the house of cards fell, he needed someone to blame for the collapse. My phone buzzed on the desk. I ignored it. I did not need to talk to them. I had everything I needed right here in front of me. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. I was not just an analyst anymore. I was a witness. And I had the smoking gun. But I was not going to fire it yet. First, I had to secure my own perimeter. I remembered Mark, my spendless boss, standing in the dining room, firing me to please my father. That was the loose end. That was the variable I had to fix before I could bring the whole system down. I opened a new folder on my desktop. I named it Project Truth. I began to drag the files into it. The bank statements, the credit card receipts, the flight logs, the emails. I worked until the sky outside my window turned a bruised purple. I saved the file. I backed it up to 3 different cloud servers. Then, I stood up and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. It was going to be a long day, and I needed to be sharp. I was about to make a phone call that would change everything. I was done fixing their problems. It was time to become one. The coffee was black, bitter, and exactly what I needed. I stood by the window of my kitchenette, holding the ceramic mug with both hands, watching the sky shift from bruised purple to a pale, indifferent gray. The world was waking up. Cars were starting to move on the street below, commuters heading to jobs they probably hated, unaware that up here, on the 3rd floor, a life was being dismantled and reassembled in real time. I turned back to the glowing screens. The data was there, but raw data is not a story. To make people listen, you have to organize the chaos. You have to build a narrative that is impossible to ignore. I sat down and opened a fresh document. I created 2 columns. On the left, I titled the section Inflow. I dragged over the scanned images of Uncle Paul's checks. The handwriting was shaky, old-fashioned cursive. For the future, he had written in the memo line of one check. Family trust, on another. I listed the dates and the amounts, creating a timeline of trust. On the right, I titled the section Outflow. This was the ugly part. I lined up the corresponding dates. The day after Uncle Paul deposited $5,000 for a stable long-term bond. My father wire transferred $4,800 to a boutique hotel in Paris. The memo line did not say for the future. It said Lena, Fashion Week. I aligned them perfectly. Input, output. Sacrifice, gluttony. It was grotesque. Seeing it side by side stripped away any lingering guilt I had about what I was about to do. This was not a family struggling to make ends meet. This was a parasite feeding on a host. And I had been the one keeping the host comfortable, while they drained him dry, but I was not finished. I needed to understand the mechanics of my own execution. Why Mark? My boss was a nervous man, yes, but he was also bureaucratic. Firing a senior analyst at a private dinner party without HR presence was a lawsuit waiting to happen. He knew that. So why did he do it? I went back to my father's email archive. I searched for Mark's name. There were dozens of emails. Most were boring. Invitations to golf, holiday cards. But then I found one from 3 days ago. The subject line was simply, a gentle reminder. I clicked it open. Richard wrote Mark. I was reviewing some old files and came across the compliance report from your department in 2019. The one regarding the server migration budget. I am sure the discrepancies were just a clerical error, but it would be a shame if the audit committee decided to reopen that case. On a separate note, we are having a family dinner on Tuesday. I need you to be there. We have a staffing issue to resolve regarding Camila. I trust you will handle it with the decisiveness a leader should show. It was blackmail. Pure and simple. My father had known about a mistake Mark made years ago. Probably a minor budget fudge to cover an overrun, and he had sat on it. He had saved it like a poker chip, waiting for the moment he needed to cash it in. And the price of his silence was my career. I felt a surge of nausea, quickly replaced by a cold, hard satisfaction. My father had made a critical error. He assumed that because he had leverage over Mark, he had leverage over the situation. But he forgot that I worked in cybersecurity. I knew where the bodies were buried, because I was the one who dug the digital graves. I exported the email. I added it to the folder. The clock on my monitor reads 6:15 in the morning. The sun was fully up now, casting long, sharp shadows across my desk. It was time. I picked up my phone. My hands were steady. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Jennifer Wu. Jennifer was the regional director of our entire division. She was a woman who scared people, not because she was loud, but because she was efficient. She did not tolerate drama, and she certainly did not tolerate liability. I pressed call. It rang once, twice. Woo, she answered. Her voice was crisp, awake. She was likely already on her treadmill or reading briefing papers. Jennifer. It is Camila, I said. I apologize for the early call. There was a pause. Camila, you are usually the first one in the office, but I did not expect a call. Is the network down? No, I said. The network is secure. But we have a personnel emergency that creates a significant legal exposure for the firm. I heard the shift in her breathing. She stopped whatever she was doing. Go on. I was terminated last night, I said. It did not happen through human resources. It happened at a private dinner party at my parents' house. Mark was present. He delivered the termination verbally in front of 100 witnesses. There was a silence on the line, heavy and stunned. That is highly irregular, Jennifer said slowly. It gets worse, I continued. I have evidence that Mark acted under duress. He was being blackmailed by my father, regarding a compliance issue from 2019. I am looking at the email chain right now. I could hear the gears turning in her head. She was not thinking about me as an employee anymore. She was thinking about the company as a defendant. A wrongful termination suit involving blackmail and extortion was a public relations nightmare. Send it to me, she said. Now. I already have, I replied. Check your secure inbox. The file is labeled Project Truth. It contains the email from my father to Mark, as well as a time-stamped log of the events from last night. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard. A few seconds of silence stretched out, tense and vibrating. My God, she whispered. I waited. I did not beg for my job. I did not ask for sympathy. I let the facts do the work. Camila, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly serious. Do not come into the office today. My heart stuttered, just for a second. Stay home, she continued. I am placing Mark on immediate administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. I will need to speak with legal, but based on what I am seeing here, his actions were unauthorized and coerced. Your termination is void. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. Take the week, Jennifer said. Paid. We will sort this out. And Camila. Yes? I am sorry. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and looked at the screen. The first pillar of my father's plan had just crumbled. He had tried to cut off my income to force me into submission, to make me desperate enough to sign his repayment plan. Instead, he had just gotten his golf buddy fired and secured me a paid vacation to plot his destruction. I stood up and walked to the window. The city looked different now. It was not a place of exile. It was a battlefield, and for the first time in 24 hours, I had the high ground. I had my salary. I had my time. And now, I turned my eyes to the folder on my screen, specifically the column on the left. The one with Uncle Paul's name on it. 1 down. 2 to go. The silence in the apartment changed texture. Before the phone call with Jennifer, the air had been thick with anxiety, a suffocating fog of uncertainty. Now, it was crisp. It was the atmosphere of a clean room, sterilized and ready for surgery. I had stopped the bleeding on my own career. I had neutralized the immediate threat to my livelihood. Mark was gone, or at least, he was no longer a weapon my father could point at my head. But the war was not over. It had just moved to a more dangerous front. I turned back to my dual monitors. On the left screen, the folder named Project Truth sat open. It was a chaotic collection of screenshots, downloaded PDFs, and email chains. It was raw intelligence. It was enough to convince me, and it was certainly enough to convince Jennifer Wu. But now I had a different audience. I needed to convince Uncle Paul. Uncle Paul was 72 years old. He still wrote checks at the grocery store. He did not understand metadata or wire transfer routing numbers. If I sent him a zip file full of spreadsheets, he would not open it. He would call my father confused, and my father would spin a story about how I had been hacked, or how I was having a mental breakdown. He would smooth it over with that confident, baritone voice, and Uncle Paul would believe him, because Paul wanted to believe. He wanted to believe that his brother was a genius and that his retirement was safe. I had to make the truth impossible to ignore. I had to make it simple. I opened a publishing program. I was not just compiling evidence, I was designing a presentation. I started with a summary page. I kept the language plain. No financial jargon. No corporate speak. Page 1. The total amount transferred from Paul and Helen Miller to the Richard Sterling Family Trust, $84,000 over 12 months. Page 2. The total amount invested in stocks, bonds, or mutual funds, 0. Page 3. The total amount transferred from the holding account to entities controlled by Lena Sterling, $82,500. I paused. The numbers on the screen were black and sharp against the white background. Seeing it laid out like this made my stomach twist. It was not just theft. It was a violation of faith. Uncle Paul had taught me how to ride a bike. He had slipped me crisp $20 bills on Christmas even when my parents told him not to spoil me. He was a good man. I and my father had looked him in the eye for a year, taken his checks, and handed them to my sister to buy handbags. I felt a surge of hesitation. It was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. If I sent this, there was no going back. This was not a private dispute anymore. This was not something that could be shouted about over a holiday dinner and then swept under the rug. This was a felony. If Uncle Paul took this to the police, my father could go to prison. Lena could be implicated as a beneficiary of fraud. I looked at my hands. They were hovering over the keyboard. I had been trained from birth to protect the family image. The first rule of the Sterling house was that we did not air our dirty laundry. We presented a united front. We smiled in photos. We never, ever let the neighbors see us sweat. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Don't be dramatic, Camila. Why do you always have to make things difficult? I closed my eyes. I tried to summon the feeling of love, of loyalty. I tried to find a reason to stop. But all I could see was the invoice. $248,000. They had put a price tag on my life. They had quantified my childhood as a debt. They had looked at me, their daughter, and seen a failed business transaction. And in doing so, they had freed me from the contract of loyalty. You cannot demand loyalty from someone you have just fired. I opened my eyes. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cold resolve. I continued working. I added the supporting documents. I highlighted the matching dates. I drew red lines connecting the deposits to the expenses. I made it visual. I made it undeniable. I saved the document as a single PDF file. I named it simply Trust Fund Audit. I opened my email client. I typed Uncle Paul's address into the recipient field. I had to look it up in my contacts to be sure. He still used an old provider from the 90s. Subject: important information regarding your investment. I stared at the blinking cursor in the body of the email. What do you say to a man you are about to devastate? Do you apologize? Do you warn him? I typed slowly. Uncle Paul. Please, sit down before you read the attached document. I have done a forensic audit of the family accounts. I believe there has been a discrepancy in how your funds were categorized. The money you sent for the trust was not invested. It was spent. The attached records show exactly where it went. I am so sorry. Camila, I read it over. It was short. It was brutal. But it was the truth. I moved my mouse to the send button. The cursor turned into a small hand, a digital finger pointing at the trigger. The sun was fully up now, flooding the apartment with harsh morning light. Down on the street, the city was moving, indifferent to the explosion I was about to detonate. I took a breath. I thought about the car keys sliding across the table. I thought about Mark looking at his shoes. I thought about my mother smoothing her dress while I walked out the door. I clicked send. The screen refreshed. The message swooshed away, vanishing into the digital ether. It was done. The packet was traveling through the fiber optic cables. bouncing off servers, making its way to a dusty desktop computer in a ranch house 3 towns away. I sat back in my chair and let my hands drop to my lap. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. 1 down. 2 down. Now, the waiting began. The message was sent. I sat there for a long time. Staring at the screen. The little notification box in the corner of my email client faded away, leaving the interface blank and innocent. I sighed as if it had not just delivered a nuclear warhead to a quiet suburban home. It is strange how momentous events often happen without sound. In movies, there is a swelling of strings or a crash of thunder. In real life, there is just the soft click of a mouse button and the hum of a computer fan. Pushed my chair back from the desk. The wheels rolled smoothly over the plastic mat. I stood up and walked to the center of the room. My apartment felt different now. For years, this space had been a refuge, a quiet corner where I could hide from the noise of my family. Now, it felt like a bunker. The walls seemed thicker, the air stiller. I was waiting for the shockwave. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 7:45 in the morning. Uncle Paul was an early riser. He usually checked his email with his morning coffee, sitting at the small oak table in his kitchen. I could visualize him perfectly. He would be wearing his plaid flannel robe. He would adjust his reading glasses. He would see the subject line from his niece. He would open it, expecting perhaps photos from the party or a thank you note. Instead, he would find the audit. I paced the length of the living room. 7 steps from the window to the kitchenette. 7 steps back. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A trapped bird trying to escape. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the night was starting to curdle into anxiety. What if I was wrong? The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. I stopped pacing. I rushed back to the desk and opened the files again. I checked the dates. I checked the routing numbers. I checked the metadata on the invoices. No, I was not wrong. The math was absolute. The money went in, and the money went out. There was no ambiguity, no interpretation. It was theft. I forced myself to breathe. In for 4 seconds, hold for 4, out for 4. It was a technique I used before presentations to the board of directors. It helped to slow the racing thoughts, to organize the panic into manageable data streams. 7:52. My phone was sitting face up on the desk, next to the keyboard. The screen was black. It looked like a monolith, silent and ominous. I went to the kitchen and poured the rest of the cold coffee into the sink. I needed to do something with my hands. I washed the mug, scrubbing it with more force than necessary, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. Then it started. It began with a single vibration. A short, sharp buzz against the wooden surface of the desk. I froze. I turned slowly to look at the phone. The screen lit up. A name flashed in white letters against a dark background. Uncle Paul. My breath caught in my throat. He was calling me. Of course he was calling me. He wanted an explanation. He wanted me to tell him it was a mistake, a prank, a misunderstanding. He wanted the niece he trusted to fix the world for him. Just like she always did. I took a step toward the desk, my hand reaching out automatically. The conditioning was deep. When a family member called, I answered. When they had a problem, I solved it. It was the programming my parents had installed in me since I was a child. But I stopped. My hand hovered inches from the device. If I answered, I would have to manage his pain. I would have to listen to his confusion, his heartbreak. And then, inevitably, he would put my father on the line. Or he would call my father immediately after, and the cycle of spin and manipulation would begin. I could not be the mediator anymore. I had provided the truth. I could not also provide the comfort. I let it ring. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. The screen went dark. I let out a shaky breath. I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and twisting, but I pushed it down. This was necessary. The silence was part of the message. 7:55. The phone lit up again. This time, the name was Richard Sterling. My father. I stared at the screen. I could picture him. He would be in his home office. Surrounded by mahogany bookshelves filled with books he never read. He would be holding his phone with a white, knuckled grip. Uncle Paul had called him. The question had been asked. The accusation had been made. My father was not calling to apologize. He was calling to contain the breach. He was calling to yell. To threaten. To demand that I retract the email. That I tell Paul I was mentally unstable. That I was off my meds. Anything to protect the narrative. The phone vibrated violently, rattling against the desk. It sounded angry. I did not touch it. I pulled my chair over and sat down, just watching. I was the analyst again. I was observing a security incident in real time. The call ended. A voicemail notification popped up. 3 seconds later, it rang again. Richard Sterling. He was persistent. He was used to being obeyed. When Richard Sterling called, people answered. When he commanded, people jumped. The fact that I was not answering was likely confusing him as much as it was enraging him. 5 calls in a row. Then, a text message. Pick up the phone. Now then another. You have no idea what you have done, call me. I read the words on the lock screen. They were commands, devoid of affection, devoid of concern. They were the inputs of a system trying to correct an error. 8 o'clock. The next name to appear was Elaine Sterling. My mother. This one hurt more. My mother rarely called. She preferred to operate through intermediaries, avoiding direct conflict. If she was calling, the situation was catastrophic. She would be crying. She would be playing the victim. How could you do this to us? After everything we have done for you. I watched her name pulse on the screen. Imagined her in her silk robe, standing in the kitchen, looking at the pristine countertops, terrified that her perfect world was about to be stained by reality. I did not answer. Then Lena. My sister's name appeared, accompanied by a picture I had taken of her years ago. She was laughing, looking beautiful and carefree. The picture felt like a lie now. She called 3 times. Then the text started flooding in. What the hell did you send to Uncle Paul? Dad is freaking out. Fix this. I can't believe you are being so petty. It's just money. Pick up. You are ruining everything. I sat there, motionless, as the notifications stacked up. 10 calls. 20. 30. The phone was hot to the touch. It was a physical manifestation of their panic. For the first time in my life, I was not absorbing their chaos. I was sitting outside of it. I was behind the glass. They were screaming, banging on the walls, demanding that I come back in and carry their baggage. But the door was locked. And I was holding the key. The silence in my apartment deepened, contrasting sharply with the digital noise on the screen. I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was not happiness, exactly. It was power. For 30 years, my family had controlled the flow of information. They decided what was true. They decided who was worthy. They decided that I was the failure and Lena was the star. They decided that my father was a genius and I was just the help. But information is only powerful if you can control who sees it. And they had lost control. I looked at the data on my screen. The spreadsheet. The flight logs. The receipts. It was just numbers. It was just paper. But it was stronger than them. It was stronger than my father's shouting. It was stronger than my mother's tears. It was stronger than Lena's entitlement. Truth is the only thing that cannot be negotiated. By 8:30, the calls had slowed down. They were regrouping. They were likely having a war council in the living room. My father would be pacing. My mother would be sobbing into a tissue. Lena would be scrolling through her phone. Worried about her image. They were realizing that the old tactics would not work. They could not bully me if I did not listen. They could not manipulate me if I did not engage. I stood up and walked to the window. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows across the street. I watched a delivery truck double park. I watched a woman walking a golden retriever. Life was continuing. The world had not ended because the Sterling family was imploding. I felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. The adrenaline was gone, leaving me hollowed out. I wanted to sleep. I wanted to crawl into bed, and pull the covers over my head, and wake up in a different life. But I knew it was not over. The digital assault had failed. They had tried to reach me through the wires, and I had cut the line. That meant they would escalate. My father was a man of action. He did not lose. He did not accept defeat. If he could not reach me by phone, he would come to the source. He would try to physically impose his will upon me, just as he had done at the dinner table. I looked at the door of my apartment. It was a sturdy door, solid wood with a deadbolt I had installed myself, but it felt fragile now. I walked over to it and checked the lock. It was engaged. I checked the chain. I slid it into place. I went back to my desk and sat down. The phone buzzed again. A voicemail from Uncle Paul. I hesitated, then pressed play. I turned the volume down low, so it was just a whisper. Camila. His voice sounded old, broken. I read it. I called the bank. They confirmed the transfers. I don't understand. Why would Richard? Why? He started to weep. It was a quiet, yet dignified sound that tore through me. Thank you for telling me, he whispered. I know this was hard. I'm so sorry, honey. The message ended. I closed my eyes, letting the tears finally spill over. He was apologizing to me. He had been robbed of his life savings, betrayed by his own brother. And he was apologizing to me for the difficulty of telling him. That was what real family looked like. That was what love looked like. It was not a ledger. It was not a transaction. It was grace. And that was exactly why I had to finish this. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I saved the voicemail. It was evidence. Evidence of the damage they had done. I sat in the chair, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight. I waited. I did not have to wait long. 9:15, a car door slammed outside. It was loud, aggressive. I did not look out the window. I knew who it was. A minute later, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were fast, pounding against the cheap carpet. Then, it came. Boom. 3 hard blows against my door. The frame rattled. Camila! My father's voice roared from the other side. Open this door. Now. I did not move. I sat in my chair, facing the door, my hands folded in my lap. Open it. He shouted again. We know you are in there. I looked at the phone on my desk. I looked at the computer screen with the truth glowing in black and white. Then I looked at the door. The siege had begun. The pounding stopped, replaced by a heavy, desperate silence. I could hear breathing on the other side of the wood. Ragged and wet, like a runner who had sprinted a marathon only to find the finish line had been moved. I stood 3 feet from the door. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the moment. I had been rehearsing in my nightmares for 20 years. This was the confrontation. This was the moment the monster came out from under the bed and demanded to be let in. Camila, my father said. His voice was lower now. Trying to find that register of reasonable authority that had worked on board members and bank managers for decades. We just want to talk. We need to clarify some things. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I looked at the leather folder on my desk. The bill. $248,000. I picked it up. It felt lighter than it had the night before. Yesterday, it had been a burden. Today, it was ammunition. I walked to the door. I unlocked the deadbolt with a loud, deliberate clack. I saw the doorknob turn eagerly from the outside, but the chain held. The door opened 2 inches, snapping taut against the metal slide. Through the crack, I saw a slice of my father's face. He did not look like the man who had held court at the dinner party. His silver hair, usually lacquered into place, was falling over his forehead. His eyes were bloodshot. There was a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He looked smaller. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour trying to put water back into a broken glass. Behind him, I saw Lena. She was wearing sunglasses. Even though the hallway was dim, she was hugging herself, her arms wrapped tight around her designer trench coat, vibrating with a mix of cold and panic. "Open the door." "Camila," Richard hissed, seeing my face in the gap. "The neighbors." I looked past him. Down the hall, Mrs. Higgins from apartment 304 had cracked her door open. She was watching, clutching her housecoat. I looked back at my father. "You should have thought about the neighbors before you started screaming," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. It was flat. It was the voice of the tech support agent telling a customer that their data was irretrievable. "Let us in," he pleaded, dropping the command tone. "Paul is talking about lawyers. He is talking about the police, Camila. You have to call him. You have to tell him you made a mistake with the spreadsheets. Tell him it was a simulation. Tell him anything." I stared at him. He was asking me to lie. He was asking me to commit perjury to cover his theft. And he was doing it with the same casual entitlement he used when asking me to fix his printer. "It was not a simulation," I said. "It was an audit." Richard gripped the edge of the door frame. His knuckles were white. "We did this for the family," he said, his voice trembling with intensity. "Do you understand? The market turned. The liquidity dried up. We needed to maintain appearances to secure the new investors. If the image cracks, the whole business goes under. We did it for you. For your legacy." I almost laughed. The sound bubbled up in my throat, bitter and sharp. "For me?" I asked. "You invoiced me, Dad. You handed me a bill for my existence because you needed cash to pay for Lena's first-class tickets." "I did not mean it," he said quickly. "It was a strategy. A shock tactic to get you to take financial responsibility. We never intended to cut you off. We just needed you to step up." I looked at Lena. She refused to meet my eyes. She was staring at the carpet, tapping her foot in a frantic rhythm. "You stole from Uncle Paul," I said. "You stole from a man who trusts you implicitly. And you used the money to throw a party to humiliate me." Richard closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "We can fix this," he whispered. "We can pay him back. I just need time. But if he goes to the authorities, everything is frozen. The house. The accounts. Everything. I will go to prison, Camila. Is that what you want? Do you want your father in a cell?" The question hung in the stale air of the hallway. I looked at this man. I looked for the father who had taught me to ride a bike. I looked for the man who had sat at the head of the table for 30 years, carving the turkey, making the toasts. I realized then that man never existed. Richard Sterling was just a series of transactions in a suit. He did not love people, he invested in them. And, when they stopped yielding a return, he liquidated them. "I am not the one who put you in this position," I said. "You did." I slid the chain off the track. Richard's face lit up with relief. He pushed against the door, expecting it to swing open so he could march in and take control. But I did not step back. I stood in the threshold, blocking his path. I held out the leather folder. He stopped, looking at it. "What is this?" "Your invoice," I said. He looked confused. "Camila, put that away. We need to call Paul." I pushed the folder into his chest. He instinctively grabbed it. "I am closing my account," I said. "I am declining the charges." Richard stared at the leather portfolio in his hands. The weight of it seemed to pull his shoulders down. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He realized I was not negotiating. I was not playing a game. He opened his mouth to speak, but Lena pushed past him. She ripped her sunglasses off. Her eyes were red and puffy. She did not look at the folder. She looked at the key rack on the wall behind me. "Where are they?" she demanded. Her voice was shrill, cracking with hysteria. "What?" I asked. "The spare keys," she shrieked. "The Audi." Dad transferred the title, but I lost the set I took. "I have a brand activation in the city at noon. I need the car, Camila." Give me the keys. I stared at her. The world was burning down around her. Her father was facing prison. Her uncle had been defrauded. And she was worried about being late to a promotional event. It was so perfectly, tragically Lena. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. I used to envy her. I used to wish I had her smile, her ease, her ability to walk into a room and own it. But now, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, she looked hollow. She was a paper doll, flimsy and two-dimensional, blowing away in the first gust of wind. I don't have the keys, I said quietly. You're lying, she screamed, stepping forward, her hand raised as if to slap me. You always keep a spare set. I caught her wrist. I did not squeeze. I just held it. My grip was firm. She gasped. Shocked that I had touched her. I had never touched her in anger. I had never touched her at all. I was the shadow. Shadows don't grab back. The car isn't here, Lena, I said. And neither am I. I released her wrist. She stumbled back, colliding with our father. Richard looked at me. His face was gray. He clutched the folder to his chest like a shield. Camila, please, he whispered. I looked at him one last time. I memorized the fear in his eyes. Not to gloat, but to remind myself, years from now, that the monster was just a man who was bad at math. Goodbye, Dad, I said. I stepped back. No, he shouted, lurching forward. I slammed the door. The sound was thunderous. It shook the walls. I threw the deadbolt. Click. I slid the chain back into place. Shish, clack. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door. On the other side, I heard Lena screaming. I heard Richard pounding his fist against the wood. A dull, rhythmic thudding. Open the door. Open the door. I closed my eyes and listened. I listened to the sound of their panic. I listened to the sound of their control shattering against the fortress of my silence. I did not move. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the quiet air of my apartment. Eventually, the pounding stopped. I heard muffled voices. Arguments then, the sound of retreating footsteps. They were gone. I turned around and leaned my back against the door, sliding down until I hit the floor. I hugged my knees to my chest. The apartment was silent again. But it was not the empty silence of loneliness. It was the heavy, solid silence of a bank vault after the door has been sealed. I looked at my hands. They were steady. My phone buzzed on the desk across the room. I did not get up to check it. I knew who it was. It was the world outside, trying to get in. But for now, I was safe. I was closed for business. 7 days later, the silence in my life had changed texture again. It was no longer the sharp, ringing silence of a grenade explosion, nor the heavy, suffocating silence of a siege. It was the hum of a server room. It was steady, cool, and functional. I sat at my desk at the office. The view from the window was the same as it had been 2 weeks ago. A parking lot, a strip of trees, the highway beyond. But the world felt fundamentally different. Mark's office, 3 doors down, was empty. His nameplate had been removed. A cardboard box sat outside the door, waiting for a courier. Jennifer Wu had been true to her word. The investigation had been swift. Mark had admitted to the pressure, trying to save his own pension. But the company did not tolerate liabilities. He was gone. I turned back to my monitor. My access was fully restored. My team treated me with a quiet respect. They did not know the details, only that I had survived a corporate assassination attempt and come out the other side with a promotion. But the real news was not happening in this building. It was happening 3 towns over. The consequences of the email to Uncle Paul had arrived with the speed and violence of a natural disaster. Uncle Paul was a gentleman. But gentlemen often have the hardest boundaries when they are finally crossed. He did not call my father back to argue. He called a forensic accountant. Then, he called a lawyer. By Wednesday, my parents' assets were frozen. The bank had flagged the accounts for suspicious activity. By Friday, the for sale sign was up in front of the house with the dying birch trees. It was priced for a quick sale. The market was not kind to desperate sellers. I heard about Lena through the grapevine of social media, observing from a distance on an anonymous account. The influencer trip to Milan was cancelled. The photos of the new handbags were gone, replaced by silence. Then, a friend sent me a screenshot. Lena was selling her wardrobe on a resale app. The captions were short, devoid of her usual sparkle. Prada clutch, never used. DM for price. The facade had not just cracked, it had disintegrated. The neighbors who had whispered about how lucky we were now whispering about subpoenas and fraud. The dinner party guests, who had witnessed my execution, were now distancing themselves, claiming they had always sensed something was off about Richard Sterling. I checked my phone. There was one new message. It was from my mother. It had arrived at 2 a.m. She must have been up, wandering the halls of the house she was about to lose, looking at the empty spaces on the walls where the art used to hang. I opened the message. It was short. I hope you are happy. I stared at the words. It was the final attempt at manipulation. She wanted me to feel the weight of their ruin. She wanted me to take responsibility for the house, the money, the reputation, everything that was currently burning to the ground. She wanted me to believe that by telling the truth, I had caused the lie to fail. But the lie was always going to fail. I just happened to be the one standing there when the roof caved in. I did not reply. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt a profound, weightless sense of release. I selected the message and hit delete. It vanished. I turned back to my computer. On my desktop, the folder named Project Truth was still sitting there. It contained the bank statements, the emails, the flight logs, the entire autopsy of my family's love for me. I moved the mouse cursor over it. I did not need to keep it. I did not need insurance anymore. They had no power left to hurt me. Keeping it would just be carrying the ghost of them around in my pocket. I right-clicked. I selected delete. Are you sure you want to permanently delete these items? The system asked. I looked at the prompt. It was the only question that mattered. Yes, I whispered. I clicked the button. The folder disappeared. I sat back in my chair and took a deep breath. The air in the office smelled like coffee and ozone. It smelled like work. It smelled like a life that belonged entirely to me. I realized then that I was not an orphan. I was not a victim. I was simply a person who had audited her life and removed the bad data. Family is not the people who invite you to dinner, to hand you a bill. Family is not the people who steal your keys and call it a lesson. Family is not the people who look at you and see an investment vehicle. Family are the people who answer the phone when you cry. Family are the people who protect you, not the people you need protection from. And love, real love, does not keep a ledger. It does not come with invoices. It does not demand a return on investment. I picked up my coffee mug. It was warm in my hands. I looked at the blank space on my desktop where the folder used to be. The balance was 0. And I had never been richer.